In the stillness of evening, when the world grows quiet and the shadows stretch long across the room, there is a comfort in stories that move slowly, stories that do not rush, do not hurry, but instead drift gently, like a candle's glow flickering across an old stone wall. Tonight, we begin such a story. It is not the tale of kings and battles, not the noise of history's louder moments. Instead, it is the softer thread, the hidden lives of queens. When we think of queens, we often imagine jewels glittering beneath candlelight, or palaces standing tall with marble columns and golden ceilings. We imagine processions, ceremonies, and the weight of crowns. Yet behind those images were women. Women who breathed the same air as we do, who sat in silence when the noise of the court faded, and who carried hearts full of emotions that were rarely written in official histories. This journey is not meant to uncover scandal or to chase gossip from centuries past. Instead, it is meant to listen carefully, to hear the whispers that echo from quiet corridors of castles and from letters hidden away in drawers. We are here to reflect on the unseen lives, the softer loves, and the secret hearts of women who wore crowns but also bore burdens. Across history, queens were symbols. They represented alliances between kingdoms, the hope of heirs, and the strength of dynasties. Their marriages were often arranged not out of love, but of necessity, tools for peace, tokens of power, or bridges between rival families. Yet even within such arrangements, the human heart was never fully silenced. Affections blossomed quietly, sometimes in unexpected places, and sorrows were carried in silence. Imagine for a moment a queen walking through the gardens of her palace at twilight. Around her, roses bend gently in the evening air, and the last traces of sunlight slip behind stone towers. She is dressed in silks, perhaps, but beneath the weight of fabric and embroidery is a woman who longs for comfort, who remembers a letter she once received, or who yearns for a moment of peace away from the demands of her station. History seldom records these thoughts, yet they were as real as the walls of the palace that surrounded her. As we begin this series of chapters, we will move through time gently, stopping at certain moments, not to rush, but to rest. We will meet queens who lived in castles and courts, some known to the world, others almost forgotten. We will see their lives not as grand spectacles, but as quiet human experiences. Sometimes joyful, sometimes sorrowful, always shaped by the hidden rhythms of the heart. There is a kind of stillness in reflecting on these women, not in the thunder of battles or the clamor of politics, but in the small details. The scratch of a quill across parchment as a letter is written in candlelight, the sound of footsteps echoing in a long gallery, the soft breath of a queen standing by a window, gazing out at a landscape she may never truly call her own. This will be our way forward, a slow uncovering, a story not of crowns and empires alone, but of emotions kept beneath the surface. A reminder that history, though often written in bold lines about kings and wars, also rests quietly in the softer, hidden lives of queens. So, let us begin. Let us draw the curtain gently aside and step into the quieter chambers of history. Here, in these hidden places, we will listen for the faint echoes of love, of longing, and of lives that carried both the weight of the crown and the secret beating of the heart. And as the night deepens, let these voices guide us, calmly, gently, through time. When we imagine a queen, it is easy to think only of the crown, the gold, the jewels, the ceremonies that made her appear larger than life. Yet the crown was only one part of her existence. Behind it lived a person, a daughter, a wife, sometimes a widow, and always a woman who carried thoughts that were seldom spoken aloud. To be a queen was to live a life shaped by duty. The court looked upon her as a symbol of grace, as a figure of stability, and often as a silent balance to the king's power. Every step she took was observed, every word carefully weighed, and every gesture filled with meaning. And yet, away from the crowds, she was as human as anyone else. Many queens spent their days following a rhythm of rituals. The mornings might begin with the attendance of ladies-in-waiting who dressed her in the layers of fabric and embroidery that were considered fitting for her rank. Breakfast, if it came at all, was often taken in the presence of others. A queen was rarely left alone. Privacy was a luxury seldom afforded to women of her position. Her afternoons might be filled with audiences, listening to the petitions of courtiers, or lending her presence to ceremonies that strengthened the king's rule. But in quieter moments, perhaps when walking through a gallery or pausing at a window that overlooked gardens or courtyards, she might allow herself to think of things beyond her public life. A letter tucked away in a chest, a memory of her childhood, the faint sound of music drifting from another hall. Love for queens was complicated. Their marriages were often arrangements woven together by politics to bring peace between nations, to secure alliances, to strengthen the power of their families. But a marriage born from politics did not always mean the absence of affection. Sometimes, quietly, real companionship grew between queen and king. In other times, the bond remained formal, distant, and heavy with silence. Beyond the crown, queens sought comfort where they could. Some found it in books, volumes of poetry or stories of saints and heroes read late into the evening. Others found it in gardens, where the soft earth and the fragrance of flowers reminded them of simpler days. Some turned to music, filling their chambers with songs played on lutes, harps, or early pianophores, letting sound soothe what words could not express. And then there were the relationships that lived in the shadows. Gentle friendships with trusted attendants, the exchange of confidences whispered in quiet corners, and the delicate hope of being understood by someone who would not betray their trust. History rarely records these softer bonds, yet they existed, sustaining queens in their hours of loneliness. The truth is that a crown was both a blessing and a burden. It offered splendor, but also weight. It brought admiration, but also isolation. To be a queen was to live in a world where one's life was endlessly watched, yet one's heart was often left unseen. As we move forward, we will meet queens whose stories reveal these contrasts. We will see the balance between the image of majesty and the reality of longing. We will step quietly into their hidden worlds, where duty and emotion lived side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension.
Beyond the crown, each queen carried her own private story. And it is those stories, the whispered, unrecorded ones, that we now begin to explore more deeply. The medieval ages were a time of stone castles, candlelit halls, and kingdoms shaped by fragile alliances. In this world, queens carried a burden that was rarely spoken of in chronicles. Their duty was immense, and yet their personal voices were often silenced beneath the weight of tradition. A medieval queen was, above all, a symbol of stability. Her marriage to a king or prince was seldom her choice. Instead, it was arranged, carefully planned by families and advisors who saw in her not a young woman with dreams, but a valuable piece of a political puzzle. Her union might bring peace to warring lands, secure trade routes, or strengthen a dynasty's claim to the throne. Love, as we think of it today, was rarely considered in such arrangements. And so, many queens found themselves carried from one land to another, far from their childhood homes, often still in their teenage years. They arrived in foreign courts where the language was unfamiliar, the customs strange, and the eyes of courtiers always watchful. It was a lonely beginning to a life already shaped by expectation. The burdens placed upon them were many. They were expected to provide heirs, sons above all, to secure the future of the dynasty. Their health, their bodies, and even their silences were closely monitored by physicians and advisors. Each pregnancy was not simply a private matter, but a matter of state. Each child born or lost was written into the fabric of a kingdom's history. Yet, behind the veil of duty, there were moments of quiet humanity. A queen walking the dim corridors of her castle at night, pausing to light a small candle at a chapel altar, whispering prayers not for kingdoms, but for her own peace. A letter written in careful script, folded and sealed, carrying her private thoughts to a sister or a childhood friend. A soft lullaby sung to her children in the nursery, away from the grandeur of courtly chambers. We must also remember the constant presence of court life. A queen was seldom truly alone. Her days were filled with attendants, ladies in waiting, tutors for her children, clerks carrying documents, and advisors discussing matters of state. Even in her private rooms, the sound of footsteps and whispers followed. Privacy was rare, and so her burdens were carried in silence, in small, stolen moments of stillness. And yet, many queens found strength in this quiet endurance. They became skilled at diplomacy, at reading the moods of those around them, at offering a word of comfort or a glance of disapproval at just the right moment. They mastered the art of influence without appearing to grasp for power. It was a delicate balance, to be seen as loyal and supportive, but also wise and capable. Some medieval queens became legends of strength. Others faded into the background, remembered only as names in genealogies. But all of them, whether celebrated or forgotten, shared the burden of a role that was at once gilded and heavy. Imagine for a moment the stone walls of a medieval castle, the echo of footsteps in a long hall, torches flickering against the cold air. In one of the chambers, a queen sits by the fire. Her crown rests on a table beside her. She is wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, gazing at the flames. Perhaps she is thinking of the land she left behind. Or perhaps she is recalling a childhood day when she walked freely in the fields before her life became one of ceremony and duty. Or perhaps she is simply sitting in silence, carrying her burdens as queens so often did, not with complaint, but with quiet endurance. The medieval queen's life was not easy, and yet within it lived moments of tenderness, resilience, and even hidden joy. These are the stories we now lean closer to hear, the soft voices beneath the weight of crowns and the heavy silence of history. Among the queens of the medieval world, few names carry as much quiet fascination as Eleanor of Aquitaine. She lived in the 12th century, a time when kingdoms rose and fell on fragile alliances, and yet Eleanor's story moves beyond the politics of her age. She was a woman of strength, of resilience, and of remarkable presence. And behind her crowns, yes, there were two, was a life filled with both duty and hidden longing. Eleanor was born into great wealth and inheritance, the Duchess of Aquitaine, one of the richest lands in medieval France. From the beginning, her life was shaped by power and expectation. She was married young, at about 15, to Louis VII of France, becoming queen of one of the most important kingdoms in Europe. Yet this marriage, though grand in ceremony, was marked by tension. Louis was a man of deep piety, drawn toward a life of devotion, while Eleanor carried with her the warmth, vitality, and independence of her southern homeland. Their temperaments, so different, rarely harmonized. Imagine Eleanor, young and radiant, stepping into the echoing halls of the French palace. Around her, courtiers spoke in measured tones, bound by the weight of tradition. For Eleanor, raised in the lively courts of Aquitaine, where poetry, music, and the songs of troubadours filled the air, the French palace must have felt cold, perhaps even stifling. Yet she bore it with grace, for such was her duty. Her marriage to Louis took her across Europe, even as far as the Holy Land during the Second Crusade. The journey was long and dangerous, filled with dust, hardship, and uncertainty. It was here, perhaps more than anywhere else, that the strains of their union became clear. History tells us that their paths drifted apart, and in time, their marriage was annulled. For most queens, such an ending would have marked the close of their story. But Eleanor's life was only beginning. Not long after, she married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King Henry II of England. Once again, Eleanor wore a crown, this time as the queen of a powerful new realm. Her life with Henry was not without conflict. He was strong-willed, ambitious, and often difficult. Their marriage produced many children, including future kings, but it also endured storms of anger, rebellion, and betrayal. And yet, beyond the struggles of politics and power, Eleanor remained a woman of resilience. She lived long, well into her 80s, an age few reached in her time. In her later years, she found herself not just a queen, but a mother and grandmother whose influence stretched across Europe. Through her children, she connected the royal houses of England, France, Spain, and beyond.
But let us pause here and look not at the grand tapestry of politics, but at the quiet humanity of her story. Eleanor loved poetry. She cherished the songs of troubadours, the verses of love and longing that drifted through the courts of Aquitaine. It was said that she herself encouraged poets and singers, surrounding her court with music and words that celebrated the softer side of life. Imagine her, seated in a candlelit hall, listening as a lute strummed a gentle melody, while a poet recited lines of devotion. For a queen who had known the harshness of war and the weight of politics, such moments must have offered peace. In her old age, Eleanor retired to the Abbey of Fontfroid, a place of stone walls and quiet cloisters. There, she lived her final years in contemplation, surrounded by monks and nuns, her days marked by the rhythm of prayer and the turning of seasons. She was laid to rest there, alongside her husband, Henry, and her son, Richard the Lionheart. Even in death, she remained at the center of a dynasty. Yet in those last years, perhaps she found something she had long sought: stillness. Eleanor of Aquitaine's life was not simple. It was filled with crowns, conflicts, and responsibilities. But beyond all that, she was a woman of spirit, one who carried both strength and softness, duty and desire. A queen with many faces, but also a heart that, like all hearts, longed for moments of peace, of love, and of quiet joy. Behind the grand images of queens seated on thrones, wrapped in silks and crowned with gold, there lived a more private reality. Though history tends to write of their political marriages, their royal duties, and their dynastic importance, it seldom pauses to consider the simple truth: queens were human, and like all humans, they longed for companionship. But in the courts of kings, trust was not easily given. A queen lived her life surrounded by eyes that watched her every movement, ears that listened to her every word. Whispers could ruin reputations, and rumors, once set loose, could echo through history long after the truth was forgotten. In such a world, the gift of true friendship was rare and precious. Many queens found solace in the company of their ladies-in-waiting. These women, often chosen from noble families, lived close to the queen, dressing her, accompanying her, and sharing in the daily rituals of court life. While some remained dutiful attendants, others became confidants. In stolen moments of quiet, away from the formalities of court, a queen might lean closer to a trusted friend and share the thoughts she could speak to no one else. Imagine a chamber lit by a single candelabra. The walls are hung with tapestries, and outside the corridors are hushed. In this stillness, the queen sits with a lady-in-waiting who has known her for many years. They speak softly, not of politics, not of treaties or marriages, but of small personal things. a memory of a childhood home, a book recently read, or even just the weather beyond the palace walls. In that moment, the crown rests quietly to one side, and the queen is simply a woman with a friend. Some friendships were carried through letters. Queens often corresponded with sisters, cousins, or trusted companions left behind in their homeland. These letters, carefully written and sealed, traveled across dangerous roads and seas, carrying not just words, but comfort. In a letter, a queen might share her joys and sorrows more openly than she ever could in the court. Though the ink faded with time, the emotions written upon those pages were often more enduring than the alliances shaped by treaties. There were also friendships formed in unexpected places. Some queens found companionship with tutors, artists, or musicians who were invited to court. A queen might confide in the person who taught her children, or in the musician who played softly while she sat in her chambers. These bonds, though hidden from the chronicles, gave warmth to lives that otherwise might have felt unbearably cold. Yet such friendships could be dangerous. A trusted companion might betray her for influence or favor. Courtiers might whisper that a queen's closeness to a friend was improper or suspicious. For this reason, many friendships remain deliberately quiet, wrapped in discretion and guarded words. A queen might never say aloud what her heart felt, but in a glance, a gesture, or the way her hand lingered briefly upon another's, the truth of her trust could be seen. What is most moving about these hidden friendships is their simplicity. They remind us that beneath the weight of jewels and responsibilities, queens were human souls in need of connection. They too needed someone who would listen, someone who would not judge, someone who could see past the crown and into the heart of the woman who wore it. In the grand histories, wars and politics dominate the page. But in the quiet hours of a queen's life, it was friendship, the gentle, unrecorded conversations and shared silences that carried her through. These friendships, though often invisible in the chronicles of kings, remain among the most human and tender parts of a queen's hidden life. Across the centuries, letters have been the keepers of hearts. They carry more than words. They carry tone, emotion, and the weight of silence that could not be spoken aloud. For queens, letters often became the only safe place where true feelings could be expressed. In a world of constant eyes and careful expectations, a folded piece of parchment sealed with wax might hold a queen's deepest secrets. A queen's life was a public one. Every word she spoke at court, every gesture she made was recorded, interpreted, or whispered about. But a letter, carefully written in her own hand, allowed her a rare freedom. Within the sweep of ink, she could allow her heart to speak. Whether addressed to a husband far away, to a family member in another land, or to someone she quietly cherished, these letters were windows into the hidden life behind the crown. Some were letters of longing. Imagine a queen whose husband, the king, is away at war or on campaign. She writes late at night, her chamber quiet except for the faint crackle of fire. Her words, though formal, carry traces of worry and tenderness. She may write of the kingdom's safety, of duties carried out in his absence, but between the lines, one may glimpse something more personal, a fear for his well-being, a wish for his return, a gentle reminder that beyond duty, there was affection.
A flower might stand for loyalty, a star for remembrance, a line of poetry borrowed from a troubadour's song for a sentiment too dangerous to write plainly. These were not declarations shouted aloud, but whispers preserved in ink. Letters could be both fragile and powerful. A single piece of parchment could bring comfort, but it could also bring danger. If intercepted, a queen's private words could be twisted, used against her, or even cost her safety. For this reason, some letters were hidden carefully, tucked into the bindings of books, slipped beneath cushions, or locked away in small chests.
Others were destroyed once read, burned slowly in the hearth so that the words would vanish into smoke. Yet despite the risks, letters endured. They gave queens the ability to speak truth in a life filled with ceremony and silence. Some of these letters have survived to this day, tucked into archives, their ink faded but still readable. When we read them now, centuries later, we are granted a glimpse into a world that history books rarely show us. We hear the queen not as a symbol of majesty, but as a woman, longing, grieving, or quietly loving. Perhaps the most touching thought is this: while palaces have crumbled, while crowns have passed from one head to another, the small, fragile letters of queens have endured. On thin parchment, in delicate script, we can still hear their voices, soft, human, and deeply personal. In these secret letters of love, history whispers to us gently, not of battles or treaties, but of hearts that beat quietly behind castle walls. And it is in these whispers that the hidden lives of queens come alive once more. History often remembers Catherine de' Medici as a powerful and calculating queen, a figure of strategy and political maneuvering in 16th century France. Yet behind the painted portraits and the reputation that centuries have layered upon her, there was a woman who lived not only for power, but also under the weight of personal duty, of family, and of quiet loss. Catherine was born into the famous Medici family of Florence, a family known for wealth, banking, and patronage of the arts. From her earliest days, her path was not her own. She was destined to be a piece of Europe's political chessboard, married into the French royal family as a way of binding ties between Italy and France. At just 14 years old, she became the wife of Henry, Duke of Orleans, who later ascended to the throne as King Henry II of France. For Catherine, it was not an easy beginning. Her new husband was affectionate, but not toward her. His heart belonged to another, the elegant and influential Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years older, who became his lifelong companion. Catherine, as queen, found herself in the shadow of this other woman, expected to fulfill her duties while living with the knowledge that her husband's love was given elsewhere. And yet, Catherine endured. She fulfilled her most important duty to the dynasty. She gave birth to children, 10 in total, though not all survived infancy. It was through these children that Catherine's true influence would later be felt, for many of them ascended the throne or married into other powerful dynasties of Europe. But to imagine Catherine only as a queen of politics is to miss the softer details of her life. She was deeply protective of her children. In an age of constant wars, plots, and rivalries, she carried the heavy burden of securing their safety. Letters she wrote reveal a mother's worry, her attempts to guide her sons and daughters through a dangerous world, her reminders for them to pray, to be cautious, to think of their duties. She also carried grief. Catherine knew loss not once, but many times. Several of her children died young. Her husband, Henry II, was killed tragically in a jousting tournament, leaving her widowed and suddenly thrust into the center of political storms. Imagine her in those days, her children still young, the throne unstable, the future uncertain. Yet she stepped forward not only as queen, but as regent, guiding France through times of religious conflict and war. Still, within this role, her private life continued quietly. Catherine loved the arts. She supported architects, painters, and scholars. She brought Italian styles of cooking, clothing, and design into France. She commissioned gardens and encouraged music, finding solace in beauty while chaos often reigned outside the palace walls. If we pause to picture her not as a queen surrounded by politics, but as a woman seated in her chambers, we may see a different Catherine. A candle burns at her desk. Papers and letters lie scattered, filled with her careful handwriting.
Perhaps she stops for a moment, gazes out the window at the garden she designed, and allows herself a breath of stillness. In that breath, she is not the feared figure of history, but a woman who is lost, who has loved, and who has borne the burdens of both crown and motherhood. Catherine de' Medici's life reminds us that behind reputations shaped by power, there were quiet layers of humanity. She was a mother, a widow, a patron of beauty, and a survivor of great sorrow. Between the demands of ruling and the long hours of reflection, her hidden life was not only about strength, but about endurance. The endurance of a queen who carried her heart quietly, even while the world watched her every move. War has always been a loud presence in history. It fills chronicles with dates, battles, victories, and defeats. But while kings and generals rode out in armor, and soldiers clashed on distant fields, queens lived their own quiet wars in the shadows of palaces and courts. Their battles were not fought with swords, but with patience, endurance, and silence. For many queens, war was not a distant rumor, but an ever-present reality. They watched their husbands depart for campaigns, unsure if they would return. They saw their children used as pawns in treaties, promised to foreign courts in exchange for peace. They lived in castles that trembled at news of sieges, or palaces that fell silent when defeat swept across the land. Imagine a queen standing at the high window of her fortress. Below, soldiers gather, the clatter of armor echoing against stone. The banners of her husband's kingdom are carried out through the gates. She does not ride with them, but she feels the weight of their departure. Each hoofbeat that fades into the distance is also a beat of her own heart, unsure of what the future will bring. During times of war, queens were often left as guardians of the realm. They managed the household, oversaw the upbringing of heirs, and sometimes even served as regents, governing in the absence of kings. This was no small task. In such times, every decision could mean the survival of the dynasty. A queen had to balance loyalty, caution, and diplomacy, even as fear pressed at her from every side.
War also meant separation. Letters became the fragile bridge between husband and wife, between parent and child. A queen might wait weeks, even months, for news to arrive. Sometimes a letter filled with reassurance, sometimes only a rumor passed by travelers. The uncertainty was its own kind of quiet torment. And war left its mark on the smallest details of a queen's daily life. Banquets grew leaner when supplies ran low. The gardens that once bloomed with color stood neglected as servants were sent away to tend to military needs. The sound of music in the halls faded, replaced by the echo of messengers' hurried footsteps. A palace, once a place of celebration, became a waiting room of anxiety. Yet, even in such shadows, queens found ways to endure. Some turned to faith, praying long into the night for peace or safety. Others turned inward, finding strength in the routines of motherhood, singing softly to children in nurseries while the world outside raged with fire. Still others used their position to plead for negotiation, quietly urging kings and ministers to consider peace instead of endless conflict. What history rarely records is the emotional toll. Behind the crown, many queens carried silent grief. They buried sons who had marched to war and never returned. They saw kingdoms fracture, their carefully built homes swallowed by the chaos of battles they could not prevent. And yet they rose each day, put on their gowns, and walked the halls with dignity, for such was expected of them. If we listen closely, we can almost hear them in those moments of solitude. A sigh as a queen closes a letter and presses it to her lips. A whispered prayer as she kneels before an altar. A long gaze from a balcony into the distance where she knows her loved ones may be fighting. These quiet gestures, unrecorded in chronicles, were their way of bearing the shadows of war. The queens who lived through these times remind us that history is not only shaped by noise, but also by silence. Their strength was not in battle cries, but in endurance. The endurance to hold a kingdom together, to wait without certainty, and to keep hope alive even when surrounded by fear. Few queens have inspired as many tales of romance, tragedy, and mystery as Mary the Queen of Scots. Born into royalty in 1542, Mary's life began with promise. She was crowned Queen of Scotland as an infant, and, from the moment of her birth, became a figure caught between kingdoms, hopes, and rivalries. But behind the grandeur of her titles, her days were filled with deep longing for love, for safety, and for peace. Mary was sent to France as a child, betrothed to the French Dauphin Francis. There, she grew up in glittering courts, surrounded by music, poetry, and learning. She was tall, graceful, and admired for her charm. In France, she tasted a life of culture and refinement, one that seemed to promise happiness. She married Francis when still very young, and for a brief time she knew the sweetness of being not just a queen, but a beloved wife. But that happiness was short-lived. Francis died after only 2 years of marriage, leaving Mary widowed at just 18. She was a queen without a king, far from home, and the bright future she had dreamed of dimmed into sorrow. France, once a place of comfort, now seemed filled with shadows of loss. And so Mary returned to Scotland, a land she had left as a child and barely knew. Back in her homeland, Mary faced challenges unlike any she had known before. Scotland was divided by religion and politics, and her presence as a Catholic queen in a Protestant kingdom made her a target of suspicion. She longed for peace, but her throne was surrounded by unrest. Even in her own court, loyalties shifted like the winds, and trust was a rare luxury. Mary's personal life, too, was marked by turbulence. Her second marriage to Henry, Lord Darnley, began with hope, but soon unraveled into conflict and disappointment. Darnley was handsome but reckless, ambitious but unstable. Their union, once meant to strengthen her reign, became a source of strife. Yet Mary endured, as queens so often did, carrying her duties forward while facing turmoil at home. The longing in Mary's life was not only for love, but also for safety. She faced plots, betrayals, and rising opposition. After Darnley's mysterious death, whispers of scandal clung to her, and her enemies grew bolder. Eventually, she was forced to abdicate for her infant son, James. Stripped of her throne, Mary fled to England, seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth I. But here too her hopes met with sorrow. Instead of sanctuary, Mary found herself confined. For 19 long years, she lived under watch, a queen without freedom. Imagine her days, walking slowly in gardens that were not her own, gazing out of windows at lands she would never rule, writing letters filled with prayers and regrets. Her captivity was not of chains, but of walls and waiting, an endless stretch of time colored by longing. And yet, even in her confinement, Mary held on to dignity. She embroidered, she prayed, she wrote. She dreamed of reunion with her son, of freedom, of the crown she had lost. Her words from these years are soft with yearning, carrying both her sorrow and her strength. In the end, Mary's life closed not with triumph, but with tragedy. Accused of plotting against Elizabeth, she was executed in 1587. Yet even at her death, she carried herself with grace, dressed with care, and walked to her fate with calm composure. Her final moments became part of the legend that surrounds her, a queen remembered as much for her suffering as for her reign. Mary, Queen of Scots, lived a life of deep contrasts, joy and grief, love and betrayal, hope and despair. At its heart was longing, a longing for peace, for safety, and for the happiness that so often slipped from her grasp. Her story, though tragic, reminds us of the hidden humanity within queens, the soft desires, the quiet endurance, and the hearts that beat behind the crowns. Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, has come down through history as one of the most powerful and enduring monarchs of England. She is remembered as the Virgin Queen, a ruler who chose her throne above marriage, who steered her country through storms of religion, politics, and war. Yet beyond her fierce image as a sovereign, her private world was one of solitude, companionship, and quiet restraint. Elizabeth's childhood was not an easy one. Her mother was executed when she was just a toddler, and her early years were filled with uncertainty. She lived sometimes in favor, sometimes in danger, learning very early that trust could be fragile and that survival meant caution. These lessons shaped the woman she became, careful, deliberate, and wary of surrendering herself too easily to anyone.
As queen, Elizabeth was courted by princes, dukes, and kings. Marriage proposals flowed from across Europe, alliances that might have secured her throne or strengthened England's place in the world. And yet, Elizabeth always refused. Some say it was a political choice, others that it was born of personal fear, still others that she simply valued her independence too greatly. Whatever the reason, she remained unmarried all her life, a decision that defined her reign and her legend. But to imagine Elizabeth as loveless would be to miss the subtler truths. In her private life, she had close companions, men she trusted and leaned upon. Chief among them was Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Their bond was one of deep affection and lasting loyalty. Whispers of romance surrounded them, and though Elizabeth never named him as more than her dear friend and servant, the closeness between them was undeniable. Picture Elizabeth walking in the gardens at dusk, Dudley at her side. They speak softly, their words hidden from others, their companionship a rare comfort for a queen who carried the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. Whether their bond was romantic or not, it gave her a kind of quiet solace, a reminder that even rulers needed hearts to lean upon. Elizabeth's life was also filled with symbolic love. She often spoke of being married to her country, a queen wedded to her people rather than to any one man. It was a poetic idea, one that gave strength to her image, but behind it was also a lonely truth. In the great halls of her palaces, amid the ceremonies and music, Elizabeth often stood alone. Her love of pageantry, poetry, and theater may have been her way of filling that emptiness. She surrounded herself with brilliance, writers like Shakespeare and Spencer, musicians and courtiers who flattered her with words of devotion. These gifts of art and language gave her court the air of romance, even when her own life was bound by restraint. Still, Elizabeth was not untouched by longing. She wrote letters, exchanged tokens, and kept the memory of her dearest companions close. Yet, always, she held herself back, as if she knew too well the dangers of giving her whole heart. For a queen, love could be perilous, an opening for scandal, a risk to power, a chance of betrayal. And Elizabeth, who had witnessed her own mother's fall, chose instead the safety of solitude. In her later years, as she aged and her strength began to wane, Elizabeth grew more reflective. She spoke less of politics and more of the past, of those who had once stood beside her and were now gone. Alone in her chambers, she often sat in silence, draped in her jewels, her face lined with age, yet still commanding. She had built her life upon endurance, but even endurance has its shadows. Elizabeth's story reminds us that queens, though mighty, were still human. Behind the crown was a woman who longed for companionship, who leaned on a trusted friend, who cherished poetry and music to soften her solitude. The Virgin Queen's hidden life was not one of emptiness, but of carefully guarded love, love that lived in friendship, in loyalty, and in the quiet spaces between duty and desire. Exile is a word that carries both silence and sorrow. For queens, it meant more than being far from familiar walls. It was a dislocation of the heart, a life spent in borrowed rooms, surrounded by languages not their own, customs that felt foreign, and a constant yearning for the places they had left behind. Throughout history, many queens lived much of their lives in exile. Some were sent abroad as brides to distant kingdoms, where they became strangers even in their own palaces. Others were forced to flee by war or rebellion, carrying only fragments of their former lives with them. Exile was sometimes gilded, filled with courtiers and ceremony, but even so, it was still an absence, a separation from home. Imagine a queen from a northern land seated in a sunlit court of the south. Around her, the air is heavy with perfumes and flowers unknown to her childhood gardens. Servants speak in accents that sound like music, but are not yet familiar. At feasts, dishes are placed before her that carry flavors she has never tasted. And though she smiles with courtesy, her heart whispers of the simple foods and voices of the place she once called home. For some queens, exile came not with marriage, but with downfall. Wars stripped them of thrones. Revolutions forced them to flee in the dark of night, bundled in cloaks, the jewels and silks of their stations left behind. They lived afterward in smaller houses, dependent on the kindness of foreign rulers, no longer sovereigns, but guests, watched, remembered, sometimes pitied. Exile brought with it a strange kind of love story. Separated from their people, their lands, and sometimes even their children, queens often poured their affections into memory. Letters became lifelines, words sent across seas and borders, carrying pieces of the heart that could not travel otherwise. Each envelope bore not just news, but longing, ink as the substitute for presence. In quiet rooms, they surrounded themselves with tokens of what they had lost: a tapestry from home, a single chest of books, a ring passed down through generations. These objects were not mere ornaments, they were anchors, keeping the heart tethered to a place that seemed ever further away. Some queens in exile adapted, finding solace in new landscapes. They walked gardens of olive trees instead of pines, listened to foreign lullabies sung by their attendants, and sometimes even came to love the lands that once felt strange. Yet deep inside, there often remained an unspoken ache, the knowledge that they belonged to another land, another story, another crown. Exile also meant reflection. Without courts pressing daily duties upon them, queens had time to look back. They thought of choices made, of alliances woven and broken, of the turns of fate that had carried them far from the palaces of their birth. Some wrote memoirs, quiet confessions of both regret and hope. Others filled their hours with needlework, gardens, or prayer, shaping small acts of beauty in place of the power that they had lost. If we listen closely, we can almost hear them. The sigh of a queen tracing her finger across a map, stopping at the border she cannot cross. The sound of her voice as she reads aloud the names of places she once ruled. The silence that lingers after she closes her eyes, dreaming of a home that feels both near and impossibly distant. Queens in exile remind us that history is not only about conquest or rule, but also about absence. Their hidden lives were shaped not by crowns upon their heads, but by the longing carried within. In their quiet rooms, far from the thrones they once knew, They became symbols of endurance, hearts that continued to beat for homes they could no longer touch.
When we think of queens, we often imagine crowns, ceremonies, and courts filled with glittering robes. But beneath the splendor, many queens lived their most human stories, not as rulers, but as mothers. Their lives were bound to the cradle as much as to the throne, and their hearts carried both the sweetness of children's laughter and the heaviness of grief. For a queen, motherhood was not only personal, it was political. The birth of an heir secured dynasties, brought stability to kingdoms, and shaped the future of nations. From the moment of marriage, queens were expected to bear children, especially sons. Their bodies became part of the story of state, and their pregnancies were watched with anticipation, their infants greeted not just with joy, but with fanfare and ceremony. Yet, behind the rituals, there was the quiet intimacy of motherhood. Imagine a queen in her private chambers, her crown set aside, her gown loosened at the shoulders, cradling a newborn in her arms. In that moment, she is not a symbol of power, but a woman humming softly to a child. Her world is smaller, warmer, filled not with councils and treaties, but with the rise and fall of tiny breaths against her chest. Queens also knew the weight of loss. In times when illness was common and medical knowledge limited, many children did not survive infancy. Mothers grieved quietly behind palace walls, their sorrow hidden from public view. The chronicles record births and deaths as statistics, but not the tears shed in private chambers. A queen's heart was no different from any mother's. It broke when a cradle grew still, when a nursery fell silent. Some queens poured their love into education, guiding their children with letters, prayers, and lessons. Catherine de' Medici wrote to her children with care, offering advice on faith, duty, and caution. Others, like Queen Victoria centuries later, filled their lives with family, writing, visiting, and worrying about their sons and daughters long after they were grown. The bonds between mother and child stretched across time, politics, and distance. But motherhood was not always simple. A queen's children were also heirs, pawns in political games, betrothed to foreign princes and princesses to secure alliances. Many queens lived with the ache of separation, sending young sons and daughters away to other lands, watching them ride off at tender ages to serve dynasties rather than stay close to the warmth of home. Letters became the thread of love stretched across borders, each word a reminder of connection and absence. For some, motherhood became a legacy that outlived them. Through their children, queens left their mark on history, new rulers, new alliances, new generations carrying forward their names and their blood. For others, it was a legacy of loss, remembered as mothers who endured grief with quiet dignity, who bore the pain of empty cradles even while the world demanded they smile in public. Picture, for a moment, a queen sitting by the window at dusk. Her crown rests on the table nearby, but in her lap lies a child, asleep, wrapped in silk and linen. She strokes the soft curls of her son or daughter, gazing out at the fading light. She knows the child is more than hers. He or she belongs to a kingdom, to a future she may not see. Still, in this moment, in the hush of twilight, the queen is only a mother, filled with love that no crown can measure. The hidden lives of queens remind us that even in the grandest courts, the most powerful memories are often not of thrones, but of nurseries. Their stories are stitched with lullabies, with whispered prayers over small beds, and with the strength it takes to carry both a kingdom and a child in the same heart. If stone walls could speak, they would tell of councils, proclamations, and oaths sworn in candlelit halls. But it is in letters, fragile, folded, sealed with wax, that we find the softer voices of queens. Words written in ink and carried by messengers across dangerous roads or stormy seas,
revealed not only statecraft, but the inner heart of a woman who could not always speak aloud what she felt. For queens, letters were both duty and solace. They wrote to kings, to children, to allies abroad, and sometimes to trusted friends or secret companions. In these lines, often hidden away from public eyes, we find tenderness, longing, and sometimes even love. Imagine a queen at her desk, the room lit by a single flickering candle. The hall outside is hushed, her courtiers asleep. She bends low, quill in hand, and begins to write, not in the formal tone of proclamations, but in softer words meant for one reader only. Her letters carry whispers of affection, her worries for the future, her sighs of loneliness, her hopes for reunion. When the ink dries, she presses the seal with her ring, entrusting the message to the uncertain journey beyond the palace gates. Mary, Queen of Scots, wrote many such letters during her years in captivity. Some were political, but many were deeply personal, fragments of a heart that still yearned for connection. Her words reveal both her longing for freedom and her enduring desire to be remembered not only as a queen, but as a woman who loved and hoped. Catherine de' Medici's correspondence with her children also shows this tenderness. Her letters mix a grace with motherly affection, reminders to eat, to pray, to take care of themselves. They read less like commands from a ruler and more like gentle guidance from a mother whose heart was bound by distance. Even Elizabeth I, who often guarded her emotions carefully, left behind letters that show a softer side. In her words to Robert Dudley and other trusted companions, there are glimpses of warmth and affection, carefully veiled but unmistakable. These letters remind us that, beneath the image of the Virgin Queen, lived a woman who craved trust and companionship. Letters were also love stories in disguise. Some queens exchanged tokens with their words, small embroidered cloths, pressed flowers, or rings enclosed with folded parchment. These were quiet gestures, invisible to history's great chronicles, but powerful in the lives of those who sent and received them. A pressed flower between pages, a ribbon tucked into an envelope, such things carried more tenderness than any royal decree. But letters could also be dangerous. A single message intercepted could bring scandal or even destruction. Secret correspondence was often burned once read, leaving behind only fragments that survived by chance. And yet, even those fragments tell us of a hidden emotional world, a queen who laughed, who worried, who longed, who loved. If we listen closely, we can almost hear them still, the scratch of a quill on parchment, the soft exhale of breath as the final word is written, and the quiet prayer that the letter will reach its destination safely. Across centuries, their words have outlived them, delicate threads connecting us to their hidden hearts.
The secret correspondence of queens shows us that power did not erase humanity. Behind treaties and crowns were women who wrote in the stillness of night, carrying their hearts into folded paper. In those letters of love and longing, we glimpse the tender shadows of lives lived both for kingdoms and for themselves. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world shifted rapidly. Steam and industry replaced horses and carriages. Ideas of democracy and revolution spread through lands once bound by kings and queens. For centuries, monarchy had seemed eternal, but now it trembled on uncertain ground. And yet, in the midst of these changes, queens still walked through palaces, holding on to dignity and grace as their worlds quietly unraveled. These last queens of old Europe lived at a crossroads of time. They were raised in traditions of courtly ceremony, where each gesture was bound by ritual, each gown heavy with meaning. But they also lived to see newspapers spread rumors in hours, telegraphs carry news across continents, and voices of revolution rise beyond their palace gates. Imagine a queen seated in her drawing room, dressed in silks, a string of pearls resting at her neck,
Around her, the world still whispers of elegance. Music played on a piano, portraits of ancestors hanging on the walls, polished silver gleaming in candlelight. Yet outside, the air is heavy with change. Crowds gather in city squares, calling not for thrones but for freedom. The queen holds her composure, knowing that her grace may be the last defense of a fading world. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sissy, was one such figure. Admired for her beauty, she embodied the glamour of a court that seemed untouched by time. Yet she also carried loneliness, a longing for freedom from the weight of royal life. Her hidden heart reflected the tension of her age, an age when queens could be symbols of tradition, but also women, yearning quietly for something more than ceremony. In Russia, Empress Alexandra, wife of Nicholas II, lived through the last days of the Romanovs. She tried to hold on to her role with devotion, deeply attached to her husband and children. But the tide of revolution swept stronger each year. Her love as a mother shone brightly, yet it was not enough to shield her family from the collapse of the empire. Her story is one of a queen holding fast to tenderness, even as the walls of history closed in. These queens, and many like them, became symbols of a disappearing world. They preserved elegance amid turmoil, hosting dinners, arranging flowers, writing letters, acts of gentleness that seemed almost fragile against the rising storms of modernity. Their crowns glittered, but their hearts carried both fear and hope, a longing to keep the old ways alive while sensing that change was inevitable. Their hidden lives remind us that even in decline, there was grace. They walked through fading palaces with dignity, smiled for portraits that would outlast their reigns, and sat quietly in gardens listening to birdsong as though the world beyond the gates had already shifted. In their silence, they gave history its last glimpse of an old order, carried softly, almost dreamlike, into the new century. If we close our eyes, we can almost see them. Figures in gowns of lace and velvet, sitting by tall windows as dusk settles. Their silhouettes are elegant, but their thoughts are heavy. They hold teacups with steady hands, but inside their hearts stir with questions: what will become of their children, their kingdoms, the legacy of their names? The last queens of old Europe remind us that endings too have their beauty. Their lives were not only about the loss of crowns, but about the endurance of elegance, the ability to hold one's head high, to smile with grace, to carry love quietly even as thrones crumbled. In their hidden hearts, we find not despair, but a soft kind of courage, a final chapter of queenship written in silence and dignity. As we come to the end of this journey, let us rest in reflection. Through each chapter, we have wandered quietly into the hidden lives of queens, women draped in crowns, yet carrying secrets close to their hearts. Their palaces may have gleamed with marble, gold, and candlelight, but behind the grandeur lived tender stories of love, longing, and quiet endurance. We began with the medieval courts, where queens navigated arranged marriages and forged alliances not through armies, but through gestures of patience, diplomacy, and whispered affection. We followed them into the Renaissance, where their beauty, learning, and hidden romances shaped cultures as much as the brush of an artist or the pen of a poet. We walked softly into the grand palaces of Versailles, the echoing halls of Vienna, and the candlelit chambers of Windsor, where the lives of queens shimmered with grace, yet also with solitude. Across centuries, one truth whispered to us again and again: queens, no matter how dazzling their crowns, were human. They loved, they worried, they wrote letters filled with tenderness, they held the hands of children, they smiled through sorrows that only their closest ladies-in-waiting ever saw. In their hidden hearts, they carried contrasts. They were figures of ceremony, yet women of feeling. They were bound by the weight of tradition, yet longed for moments of personal freedom, an afternoon in the garden, an unhurried letter to a friend, a secret glance across a crowded hall. Their humanity rested quietly beneath layers of jewels and silks, waiting for history to look closer, to listen more softly. And as we arrive at the modern age, Their stories remind us of something gentle but powerful, that love is not erased by time, nor diminished by duty. Even when revolutions toppled thrones, even when empires dissolved, the humanity of queens lived on in their diaries, in the letters tucked away in archives, in the whispered memories of those who once walked beside them. So tonight, as we close this tale, imagine a queen sitting by candlelight. The world outside may be filled with noise and change, but in her chamber the air is calm. She lifts a pen, dips it into ink, and writes a line of affection to someone she loves. That single moment, quiet, unrecorded, almost invisible, is what makes her truly human. And it is those soft, hidden lives that we have uncovered together. The crowns may have gleamed, the ceremonies may have dazzled, but the truest treasures were always in the hearts of the women themselves, their secrets, their hopes, their loves. And though centuries have passed, those gentle echoes remain, carrying us into sleep with stories not of power, but of tenderness. And so we end our journey, softly, quietly, as though blowing out the final candle in a long, echoing hall. May the hidden lives of queens remind us that even in the grandest of histories, it is the smallest, most human moments that linger longest. Good night.